I was going to start this podcast off by telling you a story or trying to put you into the mind of a stand-up comic who going through their act, maybe not even a great stand-up comic just starting out, but I would feel very disingenuous because I don't know that fucking experience. I just think I know it from watching other people talk about stand-up comedy. So I thought maybe I'll just start this podcast off by helping you guys go into the mind of the stand-up comedian, because this is what this episode's about, stand-up comedy. And then now that I'm thinking about it and trying to do my intro for this about 3 times, I was gonna say 15, but maybe 15 minutes, but not 15 times. Just trying to get into it, like maybe it's not the right way to start this podcast off by like doing something that I really don't know anything about. But I do know about watching stand-up comedy because I've been doing a lot recently, and I think that it is a great underrated art that more people need to appreciate. And that's what this episode is about. So I have no idea how these intros are going to be in the future. I was thinking of it being like this cool kind of newsworthy thing where it's like, da-da-da-da. This just in, stand-up comedy is the underrated art of the 21st century or something dramatic like that. But I realized that's quite cheesy and I just did it. So it's basically starting out the podcast like that. So, we'll see how I do in the next episode. But I mean, that's kind of cool. Fits the title in and then bang, that's the topic. So before we actually start the podcast for another minute, welcome to This Just In. Today, we are talking about why stand-up comedy is the greatest art form that not everyone appreciates, aka you should be watching stand-up comedy. We don't have any intro music, so I'm just going to cut to me pretending that I'm doing stand-up comedy to you guys because thematics. All right, I have now switched up the camera angle and moved back to replicate a stand-up set because I want to do stand-up comedy, even though I don't think I'm that great at it. I wrote a few material. During the summer, during COVID. I'm like, let's try and do something that I've always wanted to try and see if I could actually do it. And considering that now stand-up comedy is probably like the last thing you can realistically do because all the comedy clubs are like closed and, no one's doing open mics. I'm like, okay, maybe I should just write something. It's always something I wanted to try because a lot of funny people I admire started in stand-up comedy and now have done multiple other things. So why don't I try it? So in the summer, I started writing a few jokes, which are all very bad. They're all very bad. But I mean, continuing with the theme of last episode, you got to just write down shit and then see what nuggets of not shit you can dig out of it. Which I haven't done. I probably have maybe 2 pages of a Word doc filled with poor jokes and a few stories that definitely need editing and that might not be even funny. That might not even be funny. So there's that. But besides that, why did I want to talk about stand-up comedy today? So this weekend, one of the greatest stand-up comics, period, hosted Saturday Night Live. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm talking about Mr. Dave Chappelle. I was going to say someone else, but I couldn't think of it in a fast enough time and I didn't want to edit it. But so yeah, Dave Chappelle hosted SNL for the second time after he hosted in 2016 after the other election that happened 4 years ago. Wow, time flies, 4 years ago. Besides that, yeah, so he came back. I'm like, okay, Dave Chappelle's coming back to do SNL. And I think I should probably do this week's podcast episode on stand-up comedy. Because it's something that I don't think, like, despite how many stand-up comics are in popular culture and film, and I don't know if most people even watch stand-up comedy or like even have listened or know that comedy albums exist, period. So this is what I want to do with this episode. I'm going to explain to you stand-up comedy. Not explain to you stand-up comedy. I'm just going to give you my take on stand-up comedy because part of the reason why I wanted to do the not really why I wanted to do the first podcast. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast was to get a feel of just talking about yourself to an audience, kind of like stand up, but instead of being funny, I am trying to be funny. So I am trying to be funny, and it's hard because I am used to being in a podcast where you got one of the funniest people I know, period. Shout out Ian, just to reflect off and give that energy. So now taking it back, all just me having to make comedy with really no one except myself is quite hard. And I think maybe that's how it is to write stand-up, If you don't know how the stand-up process works, because I dipped my little toes in it. How stand-up comedy works from someone who's just tried the first step. My understanding is you write a bunch of material, then you take that material to shows, you see what works, you see what doesn't work, then you refine it, and then you go to another show, see what works, and then you refine it, and that cycle goes on and on and on until you have a solid set, and then you do shows and you do headlines and whatever, but that's way down the line. From what I know of the process, which is the first step of writing poor jokes and doing the bare minimum research is required to do stand-up, it is hard, and it is very like this podcast right now. I don't know if you can tell, but this does feel so much weirder just pretending to do stand-up comedy because it's so strange. Maybe because I don't have anything prepared, which doesn't help because I probably should have written something down or two. Maybe I wouldn't have had to restart this recording too many times, but you just get a feel of it. Part of it is just going into the flow, seeing what works, see what doesn't work. And it's a process, right? For most people, your first show or your first set is probably bad. And then you have to get better. You just got to keep working at it. And that's, what I'm going to try and do with this podcast as well. So yeah. Now let's get into stand-up comedy itself and why I want to talk about it so much. Now, I talked about the process, talked about what I've done in regards to stand-up comedy. Now, let's talk about what I am actually semi-familiar in, which is actual consumption of stand-up comedy. So I think I first started with stand-up comedy just watching clips off Instagram. Didn't really know major players or anything like that. Then I slowly got into finding out, this is years probably. I was just following the Laugh Factory on Instagram. And I think it wasn't until maybe a year or two ago when I started watching actual stand-up sets. And I think the first special I watched was Donald Glover's comedy thing. And considering, there you go. And yeah, so I started with Donald Glover, and I think I sporadically watched Mulaney's at some point, and I think I also watched Jesselnick's at some point. But it wasn't until maybe this past year, during this summer, when I started writing and trying to get into it, is when I went not all in, but when I went and actually looked into the process and watched more stand-up comedies, more stand-up comedians than just sporadically watching it. I went in trying to understand the jokes and to understand how structure and stuff works like that and all that. So in that process of watching all these stand-up comedies, I realized wow, a lot of these funny people started from here and then they went to wherever they went, and they had stand-up comedy as the foundation of their art. So we got Donald Glover, from stand-up comedy to Community to rapping to being Simba to being the guy he is now. We got also another person who I was very interested to find out that started in stand-up was the Andy Samberg, because he's funny. I knew him from The Lonely Island, who's a big inspiration to me. I didn't know he started in stand-up, but and then it led him to SNL, and then that led him to where he's now at Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and etc. And I think that, so yeah, there's all these people who started in stand-up. So I'm like, okay, all the funny people that I appreciate started in stand-up. So maybe that's the secret sauce to what I want to do, is starting in stand-up and just going through it and seeing what you could do there. I don't know. I was also like, oh, maybe if I learn stand-up, it'll be great for the podcast, because maybe I'll actually be funny instead of just having to rely on Ian for jokes. So there's that too, maybe. But well, I don't know how well that worked out. You can tell. You could tell from this episode, or you could tell me in person and just, fucking kicking my face. Oh, whatever. So yeah, now, so after watching everyone's stand-up specials, I kind of realized stand-up specials are kind of like how I want to structure podcasts. And I kind of noticed this, how we did it with the other podcasts. And this is kind of how I want to set up the blueprint for going forward. So like a stand-up set, like an hour, would be like a bunch of interspersed jokes and stories, depending on the comic, but generally they all are a mix of both. And there's like, and they just talk about it for an hour, but they're all kind of connected until the very end sometimes, when they all tie everything together. But usually it's just one story, a few jokes in it, one story, another story, a few jokes in it. And whatever everyone does it differently, but that's a general gist of it. And to prepare for this episode, I watched Dave Chappelle's, of course I watched his stand-up his monologue from SNL. And then I watched his Bird Revelation special on Netflix. And then I also watched his Sticks and Stones special on Netflix. Two great specials that I think, if you Google anything about the reviews, it'll probably be like, oh, Dave Chappelle is not only a stand-up comic, he is a great philosopher of the 21st century America, blah, blah, blah. And that's all true. And I think it's another element of why I think stand-up is so great, because of, with comics like Dave Chappelle, and I don't know any other comics who kind of do that philosophical take on comedy. I'm sure there are. I'm just not deep enough in it where I'm like, oh, bang, 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 bang. I can tell you every stand-up comic and what they're for, or what their style of comedy is. I can tell you the 3 stand-up comics that I will watch more than the other people, or semi-regularly. And I can kind of tell you what they talk about, because, I watch their things occasionally. So there's that. But as I was saying with Chappelle, him just interweaving comedy and philosophy was like it's such a art, and like the way that they do it on stage, it makes it seem so seamless, how they just go from one topic to another, to another, to another. And the thing about that is, you don't know, well, for most people, you don't know that special, that hour was the product of like however long they were setting up, going through different shows, going through all their material and stuff. And considering that Dave Chappelle did like what, 3? Not 3. He did a few specials within like 2 years or something. That's a lot, because like from what my understanding is, like stand-up comedy, it takes like a year just to get like a good 5 minutes, depending on how good you are. But I guess it's Dave Chappelle, so he's fucking amazing, so it doesn't take him that long to smash out 3-hour sets that are all great. But then there brings me to today, or this week, with his 16-minute monologue for SNL. And I think that's where the real the more honest portrayal of stand-up, from my understanding, is that instead of like an hour of banger after banger after banger after banger, it's like 15 minutes of solid, like 5 minutes of solid jokes, and then 10 minutes of stuff that he hasn't fully worked out yet, that are to no. And I think that's how it is. And that's how like a podcast is. So you get really like we get maybe 5 minutes of clips that we can post out of a 40-minute episode, out of a half an hour episode. And I guess in that it's kind of the same, like of clippage to non-clippage. But the thing about stand-up is like that 20-minute set, as long as you don't post it on YouTube or whatever, and you just work it through the comedy shows, you can just get it better and better and better. But when you come to the podcast, once that 5 minutes is that section of the podcast is clipped, you can't really go back because it's a podcast and it's fluid. But stand-up comedy can be fluid too, so there's that. So yeah. So I wanted this episode to be explaining why you should watch stand-up comedy. And I don't know if I've been doing a good job of that. So this is what I'm going to do for like this last closing out bit. I'm just going to give my best to tell you why you should be watching some sort of stand-up comedy. If that be clips on the YouTube or full-out specials on Netflix and such and such and such. Or even going the further extent and listening to a comedy album. So, why is stand-up comedy underrated art that you should definitely look into? Well, if I did not explain enough before, very poorly I'm sure, but it is a fucking crazy talent to weave in all these narratives and jokes into a cohesive 5-minute performance art where all you really have is what you've written down and yourself. Unlike other arts where you have film, you have the visuals and you have the music and you have the story, and the music you have the lyrics and the performance and the instrumentals, and paintings you have fucking paintings, the brushstrokes, picture, color, and stuff like that. With stand-up comedy, you just have your voice, your material, and your delivery. 3 things that you can't really tangibly grasp. And it's hard. Like, I am struggling right now just to get through 20 minutes of this podcast by myself. And I definitely should have prepared something, but I didn't. That's fine. But take it even further. I'm just talking about something. With stand-up comedy, you're going out on a stage and be like, hey, I am going to entertain you and I'm going to make you laugh. And as someone who tries to make people laugh in person and on videos in this podcast form, it is really, really, really hard. Okay, another reason why you should watch stand-up comedy besides the artistry, because it is fucking hilarious. If you don't enjoy laughing, what is wrong with you? Because stand-up comedy is all about that. It's just trying to make you laugh. And there are so many stand-up comics that probably fit whatever taste you have or whatever things that are relatable to you, that there's definitely a stand-up comic that will make you laugh. And what is wrong with finding laughter, especially now when everything is so dark and sad? You know, having a little giggle for an hour is just something, great. And because there are so many stand-up comics and there are so many different kinds of comedy, there will be something for everyone. It might take you a while to find the comedy that hits you right in the spots. It might take a while to find the comic that's for you. But once you find that comic that is for you, that you find every joke lands or whatever, or you can just listen to talk for hours, you will have something to come back to every time you feel down or whatever. There will be that stand-up comic and their stand-up specials waiting for you to be consumed and enjoyed. So there's that. And to close it out, I think stand-up comedy is something that kind of struggled because of the situation we are currently in. Not a lot of people there's no clubs. There's no, there's number one, there's like no clubs that you can go to. And I think that when everything is all opening back up, take the time, go to a stand-up show just for the first time. I've never gone to a show either because, I didn't really know about it until this year. And then when I really wanted to, everything started opening back up. And then it started closing back down again when I was actually going to pull the trigger. So yeah, I think it's a great thing to support, especially now where I think if movies struggled, stand-up comedy definitely struggled too because, clubs were closed, all that stuff. And the final reason why you should check out stand-up comedy is because it is an art that needs everyone's support, especially now during these times. It's super hard for clubs to stay open, for comics to get work and stuff. I think now that everyone has time to, or is used to at least checking out content on your phone or your computer or whatever, go check up on local comics, see their stuff, and then when everything comes back open, go support them on a show. Help foster the next generation of great talent. You never know where it could lead someone. Like I said, all these great people who started in stand-up and now are doing great things in other fields relatively related to stand-up, but still different than stand-up. You never know who you could find. And I think that's the great thing. Or you could just find great comics, period. All right. Closing it out. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Give me some recommendations for some stand-up comics I should check out, and give you some recommendations for some stand-up specials I should watch. If you want some of my recommendations on what you should watch / look out for, of course, Dave Chappelle. Check him out. John Mulaney. Check him out. And check out some local stand-up comics and comedy clubs. Just search up wherever you're from, comedy clubs, see if they're opening up soon, see who's going. And if you feel appropriate or if you feel safe enough to do it, maybe not now, but maybe when everything's back to a reasonable level, when the things are quite lowered, go to a show, check it out. It could be a great time. You never know. It might be something that you are, it might be something that you never thought about before, but after you go on to your first show, it's something that you will do forever and ever and ever. And you'll just be a fan of stand-up comedy, like I am, or I'm trying to be. All right, guys. I'll see you in the next episode next week on Tuesday. Don't forget to follow on all the platforms and subscribe on all the platforms. I will see you next time.